Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke, and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The Preservation Association of Lincoln is sponsoring the taping of today's program. Our speaker today is Ed Zimmer. Ed was a historic preservation planner in Lincoln city and county government from 1985 to 2020. Since retiring, Ed remains an active community historian and volunteer. He recently finished 2 books, the 3rd and final volume of the Near South Walking Tour book and a book on Lincoln postcards with Jim McKee. Ed is native to Omaha, Nebraska, and has an undergraduate degree from Lindenwood College and a PhD from Boston University. Ed's talk today is the supervising architect of the Treasury in Nebraska. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you for coming. This is more festive if you're here, unless you all fall asleep. You'll have to give me an assessment at the end of the topic, whether this is a falling asleep topic. Might be a little dry. One of the wonderful things about the supervising architect of the Treasury is they had to file an annual report. And so there's a lot of background information, and much of it's available online through one of those wonderful digital libraries. So this is a key year in the beginning of Lincoln's involvement, Nebraska's involvement, supervising architect, and it's also our intro slide. Supervising architect of the Treasury was a federal office within the larger Treasury Department, operated from 1852 to 1939. And in that time, there were 16 supervising architects. It's a little hard to count because some of them were acting, some of them were fully appointed but called themselves acting, and we can't claim the first 2 because we weren't a state yet. And so we only go back to the 1870s with the supervising architects, although looking at it statewide, which is what I want to do here, we can touch into 1869, and just 2 years after Nebraska was founded. There are a couple of really good books on the broad topic. My friend and wonderful architectural historian of Washington, D.C., Pamela Scott, has done a whole book on the Treasury building itself in 2010. And in the back is a lengthy appendix of all the different departments that were part of the Treasury at some time or another. The Coast Guard and the Lighthouse Service and the supervising architect of the Treasury from 1852. But on the subject alone, her friend Antoinette Lee has done a book specifically on the supervising architect. This is Magisterial, which has only been used in describing one report I ever wrote, and I had to look it up. But I think it means in the sense, and I mean it in the sense of authoritative, not the rigid bureaucratic meaning of magisterial, but rather hers is the authoritative work on this office, goes beginning to end, and if you go to the index and look up Nebraska, we're not there. Because of all the states and in the whole country, she can't do every building. So we have the website that Dave Murphy founded about 2012 that we call Placemakers of Nebraska, the Architects. And we're trying to cover all the architects who practiced in Nebraska or who had a building in Nebraska who are deceased. So there are names in here in red, which are the ones still alive, and all the ones in blue, we're trying to get it to where you click on it and there's their own page and it tells you about that career. And it includes figures like Frank Lloyd Wright with only one building out in McCook, but it's his building here, so we cover that. On some of these figures, the best site in the world is our little page, because they're people who aren't well recognized elsewhere or who traveled around a lot. William Wilcox, who did the second Nebraska state capitol, is better represented, I think, on Placemakers than anywhere else because he practiced in about 6 different cities. But he did the Nebraska state capitol, he did a university building, and he did the old stone church of St. Paul Methodist that burned down. So he's an important figure in Lincoln. No one else paid much attention to him. So we have to pick up all those strands and bring them together. With these figures, they're all represented somehow on Wiki and other sites, but the Nebraska work is not deeply represented, except on our page, where I decided I could treat them much like an architectural office or a practice, a joint practice, and then within that put the various individual figures, and it takes this many. All of these blue ones one could click on and it would go off, scurry off to their own page. And then there are some other figures who just in the broader universe of Nebraska architects have had some contact with the supervising office. Between appointments, folks would often lobby for appointment as supervising architect. And John Cohn, who's not well known but practiced in Lincoln a while, was an applicant in 1894. John Latenzer, much better known, and sometimes credited with the post office courthouse in Omaha, of which he was not the design architect, but he was hired as the supervisor on site of that decade-long construction. And in fact, Latenzer was hired by the supervising office to supervise some other site projects around the country. So there's this significant linkage there. A few of those other figures go in that other architects associates category that we use. The buildings and projects we don't try to put on the master page, but each one is branched off. And we didn't really go beyond their Nebraska work because all these people had before and afters, and very little of it, except when I just couldn't resist, really belongs within the Nebraska wiki. But this is the rest of the story. I'm going to give you an hour's worth of what I could draw off this page. And we'll start with Alfred B. Mullet. Mullet was supervising architect from mid-1860s to 1874. He did some huge buildings in that period, things like the Boston Post Office Courthouse. And this I put in as a very good example of Mullet's style. He is French Second Empire, where you use lots of classical detail, but you're not trying to assemble it into a temple form. You're just putting it all over the building and almost always finishing it off with a mansard roof. His biggest one of those was what they originally called the State, War, and Navy Departments Building, and later called the Executive Office Building, and now called, I believe, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, just adjacent to the White House, still stands, and it's about 4 times this size, huge office building in Washington, D.C. Our Nebraska story starts with a much reduced example of Mullet's work. This was the Omaha Custom House Courthouse Post Office in downtown Omaha of the late 1860s, early 1870s. And Mullet uses all of his characteristic elements, but on a reduced scale for this building. I love what he says about this when it's in construction. In his annual report of 1873, he said, "The public building at Omaha, Nebraska is elegant and convenient, but perhaps open to the criticism that it is too good for its locality. I am of the opinion, however, that it is not desirable to erect inferior buildings in cities of the prospective importance of Omaha." So he's looking ahead and feel confident that the future of the town will justify the action of the department. The building will be a credit to the government, an ornament to the city. We've got a little more Mullet here I have to bring up. Well, he says it's going to be fine. It's a great place to come and do government business. And so it's too much for now, but they'll grow into it. And in fact, they vastly outgrow it within less than 2 decades. It does get built. He was concerned that when it was under construction that the budget would only allow him to build 2 stories, but he gets the whole thing built. And this was the federal post office courthouse in which the standing bear hearing, the habeas corpus hearing of 1879, Judge Dundee, the speech to the judge occur in this building in downtown Omaha. which would seem to me that if they needed to make a movie about this subject, they might look to Lincoln, and I'll show you why. Mullet is also, in his practice for supervising architect, gets the job of a post office courthouse federal building in Lincoln, and is right at the end of building the Omaha project. He gets the foundation in, and this would be a good representation of Mullet's work in Lincoln, because when the foundation is in, he leaves the office in 1874. William Appleton Potter is appointed the next supervising architect, and Potter tells us, well, Mullet says, I've got a good site in Lincoln. The city offered a site, we've looked it over, we've approved it. We didn't have to buy it. It was a donated site, and this one will be just fine. This is being built on what was on the original 1867 plat of the city as Market Square. And the city deeds it over to the feds to build the post office courthouse. When we're a town of a few thousand people, but it's the capital city, and the push is we'll grow into a building, give us one much bigger than our population justifies at the time. Mullet puts it in the ground and then leaves the office, and is succeeded by, here it's starting to come out of the ground, so we'll get to his successor. William Appleton Potter comes next, and says that while work was suspended after building the basement, they take the winter off, it was found the plans prepared by the late supervising architect, which would be Mullet, involved the necessity of an expenditure in excess of the amount to which the cost of the building was limited. So we can't build Mullet's building here. He drew new plans, they were approved, and that was what was under construction then by Potter. Well, and we see a little bit here of it coming out of the ground, and here's Mr. Potter. He's from New England. He's supervising architect only 2 years. If we look at the whole span of supervising architects, 5 years was about the average term, but more than half of them served only 2 or 3 years. So we had a couple of long tenures, lots of very short tenures, so we're rolling through the office quickly. Potter's work did not typically look like Mullet's work at all. Here's Potter's Pittsfield Athenaeum, or Berkshire Athenaeum in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It's being built while the Lincoln Post Office Courthouse is being built. Potter typically is building high Victorian Gothic. We get the Gothic arch, we get the multicolor, lots of texture in the surface, much more what we might think of as Victorian, but stylistically categorized, he's a pretty faithful high Victorian Gothic guy. Polychrome, pointed arches, steep roofs. His most fabulous building, and this one is going up while the Lincoln Courthouse Post Office is being built, is the Knox Potter Memorial Hall, which was begun in the 1850s as just a basement, and then really built in the 1870s by Potter and his brother Edward Potter, who was also an architect, in cooperation with their father, who was a professor at Union College. You don't think of this as looking like College View, because this is Union College in Schenectady, the other Union College. Part of the reason that we now don't have a Union College in Lincoln, we have Union Universalist University, because people kept crossing wires on which Union College is a student calling for help to get their car unlocked in the parking lot, and sometimes they would end up half a continent away. Well, this is Schenectady, New York. Potters helped finance the building, and that's why their name's on it, as well as the originator, and it's high Victorian Gothic. What's inside there? Not much. It's a big drum with galleries around 3 levels, but it looks up into a wonderful constellation dome up above. So that's more his preference. That's not what we're getting in Lincoln on the foundation that Mullet had laid down. But if we look at what do we assign to Potter and what do we assign to Mullet, Potter gets the whole top of the building, Mullet the basement and the foundation. The footprint, the size, the scale pretty much would be dictated by Mullet's beginning, but all the rest is Potter going up from there. It's really a third supervising architect, James Hill, who finishes the building, because when they're turning over every 2 years, these are often 4 and 5 and 8 and 10-year buildings. And he lays out in his report in 1877, after considerable difficulty and delay, suitable building material was obtained for the superstructure of this building. We're still a very new community when this is being built. We don't have readily available stone. It was locally found, but it was not an easy thing to build a stone building at this time. And he said in October 1877, it'll doubtlessly be roofed over within the year. I think it was 79 that they really finished the building. Total cost for the original construction about $170,000. It crosses $200,000 by the time they finish the site and a couple last steps. So here we have the building as pretty much Hill finished it, from inheriting from Mullet onto Potter. And this would be one of the earliest views. We're on O Street at about 9th, looking northeast across the building. Still rough grounds, really no site preparation's been done. And that's dirt O Street out in front of it. Hill's contribution is basically the site work and the landscaping of the grounds. They treat what they were typically calling Post Office Square. We would call it Government Square, but what in the earlier days was referred to as Post Office Square as a park. Courthouse Square, sort of open space in the retail heart of downtown, diagonal pathways across, a fountain in the middle, and the fountain was designed by the supervising architect's office under Hill, put in about 1880. There was already an artesian well there, very deep well, I think it was over 1,000 feet, and it produced very salty, high mineral, nasty water, which people would drink a little bit of every morning because it tasted so bad it must have been good for you. And it was quite popular to go get your little cup of the fountain water in the mornings. We also see, and I'll get in a little closer here for you, on the O Street face of the building, that little dark line, that's the beginning of the Dakota sandstone wall that runs along the O Street face of the building still today, unless it rained last night and finished eroding it away back into dust. But that was the early appearance of the wall and part of Hill's contribution to the site. A little bit later view with the fabulous two-story bandstand up at the north central edge of the site on the left edge of the picture, and Hill's fountain in the middle of the square. We're looking over and you can just see a ghostly image of the second state capitol on the horizon to the left among all the church steeples of South 13th Street. In early newspaper accounts around 1890, when the bandstand is new, as many as 1,000 people would fill this square for open-air summer evening concerts. Not necessarily jazz, but this is Jazz in June, proto-Jazz in June. One of the fun things about this topic is postcards and post offices maybe have the highest degree of overlap of their Venn circles. I don't know if even churches or schools get it frequently postcarded as post offices. So I think I've got a postcard view of almost every building I'm going to show you today. By this time we're in the first decade of the 20th century, because we can see next to the state capitol in the greater distance the taller tower of St. Paul Methodist of the first decade. It gets cut down in 1912 to its present height. And one of the better early views of the fountain in the middle of the north part of the square. So that'd be Mr. Hill's work there, the wall and the fountain and the park-like treatment of the square. Mifflin E. Bell follows, already of 1883. Next supervising architect, he's from Chicago. He had done some work on state capitals, and that was part of his credential to come into the supervising architect work. And he gave us really one noteworthy building, and that was the Nebraska City Courthouse and Post Office. While it was still under construction, the U.S. Senator from Nebraska was from Nebraska City at the time, and he got another $31,000 tacked onto the budget here to build a wing addition on it while it was still under construction. It was said that there was concern, he was Senator Van Wyck, how are they going to extend the building while they've already laid it out and have it underway? And a Nebraska City newspaper says, well, the senator's wife is really quite a good architect, and she's got a scheme that'll work, how the roof lines will go together. And the supervising architect says, well, good enough, that works for me. And they build that combined plan. It's a handsome building, and still, like the others, it has to go through multiple architects' terms. It's not finished under Bell. William Ferret, which seems wrong. He's from New Orleans. Why isn't it Ferret? His father was the mayor. There's a street in New Orleans of that name that has big festivals, and they say Ferret. So if that's what they say in New Orleans, that's what I have to say here. It's hard to do. What he gives us is not only he substantially finishes the building, but he was from New Orleans. He had been a Confederate officer. He got the commission of rebuilding the burned down Civil War era state capitol of Louisiana and put back on it this stained glass roof, which has nothing to do with Nebraska or supervising architect other than he gives me just enough standing to put up this beautiful picture and put it in the show. So that's the old Louisiana state capitol, not the one that was stolen from Nebraska and the ugly copy of our state capitol of ours much better. This is the pretty Capitol dome. But it's really James Windrum who finally finishes the last steps on this building in his terms, because it isn't finished till 1889. His main contributions in Nebraska, other than finishing the Nebraska City Courthouse, he did some additional site work in Lincoln, and he finally got resolved in Omaha a vexing question of where will we put the new post office courthouse? We just built one under Mullet less than 2 decades before, but they already need a bigger one in Omaha. And Windrum plays a role in getting that decided, and then his term ends just 2 years after he starts in 1891. And it's his successor, Willoughby Edbrooke, who designs this fabulous, enormous post office courthouse custom house for Omaha, downtown. Again, Edbrooke is only in office 2 years at the very beginning of the 1890s, but and it takes over a decade to build this building. It's under construction even into getting its first edition up till about 1902. But they're faithful to Willoughby Edbrooke's design and get this built step by step by step. Early postcard view, it was granite on the lower portion and sandstone above. A fabulous, huge building that really did get built, because here it is, not in the colored postcard, but in a photo with cars on the street, and then is torn down in 1966 with only this one arch, not on its original location. This is over at 11th and Farnham, as on part of the second iteration of the Jean Leahy Mall. They do call the playground just adjacent to this Arches Playground. So there's the arch, next to it's the playground. It's the last standing remnant. There's some other decorative pieces in gardens around Omaha, but this is the last downtown standing remnant of that huge building of the 1890s. Edbrooke, while he's in town, also does the design for Beatrice's courthouse post office, which gets built and demolished, and Fremont's post office courthouse, all stone, gets built and still stands. So this is our one Edbrooke federal building still in town, and Bless Fremont still remains there as I think the visitor center chamber building is the use today. It's not a post office. It's really rare that these earlier generation post offices, even if they survive, like the ones in Lincoln, aren't post offices any longer. Edbrooke is here so briefly. He can't finish his own buildings, but rather Jeremiah O'Rourke, who follows him from 93 to 94, does the substantial construction for them. Irish-born from Newark, New Jersey, when he comes up to be, or goes down to be supervising architect for a couple of years. Couldn't find a really good portrait of O'Rourke. It's kind of a faded sort of obituary view until I tracked down one of his biggest buildings was the federal building in Savannah, Georgia, which of course you will all know as the Tamachichi Federal Building in Savannah, on which in marble O'Rourke got a portrait bust of, or just a head of himself on 2 locations on the building. Only example I know of, I've got a few of these architects in bronze from later projects, but it's the only one I know where someone put their own face, one of the supervising architects, in these very brief terms they served, got his own portrait in marble on his building with US carved above him. But the Omaha building's still under construction, so we have to bring in our next architect, William Martin Aiken, who serves for 2 years, 1895 to 97, while they're still building away here. He visits Omaha, in fact, takes it's like the grand tour of Europe. Well, he takes the grand tour of the US from coast to coast, and I think he's got plans to go up to Alaska when the Secretary of the Treasury, for whom he works, says, get back here to Washington. But he had gone through and visited Omaha and said this progress was going well and praised Latenzer's work supervising on the site. He's most notable, to my mind, in Nebraska for the fellow who came before him and after him and was never the appointed supervising architect, but a man named Charles Kemper. Between O'Rourke and Aiken, and between Aiken and his successor, served as the head man in the office between full appointments. Kemper was an attorney, but he claimed credit for, and on the drawings it said, he was the acting supervising architect for the U.S. government building at the Trans-Mississippi Expo in Omaha, 1898-99. And he credited his chief draftsman, who must have been the designer because the acting supervising architect, who was an attorney, probably didn't design this, but he had his name on it. So I've blown up. This is Taylor giving credit to Kemper as the acting supervising architect when this went up. Omaha's Trans-Mississippi Expo had a huge lagoon. This sat at the very head of it. The buildings were temporary, intended from the beginning to be temporary. They're built of what was called mast, which is plaster and lath, painted white to look like a big masonry building. And the next year they would knock them down if they didn't burn down before they got to the next year. So the building did not stand long, but a big, fabulous building. And it was credited to Kemper, always in the publications, although he then said, and my chief draftsman, in charge of all the detail, and in charge probably of all the thing, was Edward Crane, chief draftsman in the supervising architect's office. And here's a view of it on dedication day, I believe. And it was a big, fabulous pile of plaster and lath dominating that lagoon for the Omaha Festival. Crane was active enough in this, he not only drew it, he visited the site in Omaha to look over the ground before it was ever built and came back the next year to see it finished. So he was really very actively involved and went on to a full career in architecture. He was a skilled and talented architect, but he had this brush by with the supervising architect's office. I put him on the wiki page, but under associated figures. I put Kemper up among the architects, but with kind of an asterisk of it's before and after others. In fact, I think Kemper may have been why Aiken didn't serve any longer, because he was a better buddy of the son of the Secretary of the Treasury than Aiken was. It was a highly political office. One reason the terms tend to be so short is they would burn them out in a hurry. And it was a hot seat. But a remarkable survivor in the office and a major contributor, I think, to the built environment of Nebraska was Aiken's successor, James Knox Taylor. I gave his life dates and then his service dates. 15 years he was in the office after we'd had half a dozen supervising architects in the preceding decade. So he had been in the office as the chief draftsman and probably had a hand in any of the preceding work for a couple of years. A project that had been hanging for the preceding couple supervising architects was the South Omaha Post Office. And James Knox Taylor publishes this lovely drawing with his own name on it, because he does seem to be the principal author of it, even though the program had, I think, been laid out previously. And it's wonderful that this one is not only extant, it is still a post office. This is at 4730 South 24th Street in Omaha, built when South Omaha was a separate incorporated town of 20,000 plus people before it's annexed into Omaha. But the post office is still there, fabulous building, beautiful brick and terracotta ornament, and in remarkably intact shape, and one of the first buildings that we can credit to James Knox Taylor in Nebraska. Much smaller community of about 3,000 when it's designed in 1900 is the Blair Post Office, James Knox Taylor's second of what's going to be over a dozen major buildings around Nebraska. And this building still stands, an office building now. They built a modern post office, but it's got that fabulous eagle over the front door, and also in good condition, but not a post office. As that's going on, and it's hard to precisely line these up because they're often authorized, designed, have to fight to actually get a site, get the additional funds. But the first publication on the Lincoln's new post office comes in 1902 with this rather lousy drawing, even though the headlines say, "Will be a beauty, pencil sketch pleases." I think this is the newspaper artist drawing from something he'd been sent what the new post office was to look like. Because really it was going to look like this, which we would recognize because that is what the east face of the early 20th century Lincoln Post Office Courthouse looks like. James Knox Taylor's Beaux-Arts neoclassical kind of work, ornate emphasis on colonnaded entrances and rich moldings around the windows, full entablature at the top, and then a balustrade, and up at the top under that flag, which coyly breaks the line of the drawing's square, that big cartouche in front of it. Now it looks rather like another building going up at almost the same time out of Taylor's office, and that's this one, but this is sort of the shrunken down version slightly. Hastings was getting a very similar post office to Lincoln in the first couple of years of the 20th century. But as built, it was going to be brick and stone. So it's only in that one monochromatic earliest view that you might mistake it for Lincoln. So let me finish a little more Lincoln. It's built between 1904 and 1906. Entrance to the east, wide staircase with 3 entrance doors on the east side. Secondary entrances both south on the alley or towards kind of the south half of the park, and the old post office converted already towards being the city hall, and another entrance to the P Street side. So entrances on every side of the building, and that we might think of that alley south entrance as being secondary, but you can see that's the visible entrance from 9th and O, even on this snowy day. Some fabulous both street lights and smaller lights on the government square itself. Coming around to the other corner, the 10th and P corner, main entrance, of course, was the east side, but a important entrance with its own flanking lights on the north side on P Street. And then you step inside to this fabulous interior of cast iron cage grates, postal boxes, oak woodwork, marble wainscoting, terrazzo floor. And then around the back side, a full dock for the mail horse and wagons to come up and begin the mail delivery process out from the post office. They had to shrink down the little public square because they filled up the east side of it, but they just kind of compressed it and put in new diagonal walks to the new fountain located in the center of that square. And so we get here the original generation federal building and its replacement in one postcard view, probably taken from the Lincoln Hotel, the predecessor to the Holiday Inn, to the Hilton Holiday Inn Graduate on the site. But that's where we'd get this nice view. We even get a couple of close-ups, and these are photographs by the janitor in the building, better known as my favorite, John Johnson, the photographer who took lots of pictures throughout the community, and particularly of his workplace and his work crews. That's Sam Mellick in his new automobile in the middle of the view, the warden, the sheriff, sometimes the postmaster showing off his new car. A snowy scene that gives us a nice close-up of the light, the electric light that's being installed around the government square. We're looking here north and a little bit west, and that the stepped building is the Journal, Nebraska State Journal building of the early day. So we're looking to the corner of 9th and P. And the light post was designed by the supervising architect's office with James Knox Taylor's signature at the top corner, and across the middle bottom, electric light post. So it's going to be 4 lamps, an eagle with an outspread eagle at the top. A few of the bottoms of the posts still exist. We don't have any of the eagles left. And here's the fountain in its newer location, another Johnson view. And he often liked to photograph his fellow workmen and women at the post office site. And behind is the relocated fountain, which doesn't look to my eye like the fountain in the postcards, which was a little more pyramidal in shape, but this was the granite fountain that sat on the new relocated site. And I think maybe this lady has tasted the water and is throwing it back in, because something's happening with her right arm. And the boy standing there, I think, is saying, "I'm not going to drink that." Okay, off to Norfolk, and we have Taylor designing with an eagle right over the door again, this brick and stone lovely courthouse. Grand Island, where we've brought the arched openings down to the street level, and the courtroom would be above them. York, down to 1 story as some of the communities get smaller. York was about 5,000 or 5,100 population in 1900. This is being built towards the end of that decade. Columbus, Plattsmouth in brick, but with, instead of the engaged columns, pilasters all the way across the front. And a Solomon Butcher photo, the great itinerant Nebraska photographer who we think of with Sadi's and Pioneer pictures. Well, this is Pioneer Kearney in 1907 with their all-stone courthouse post office under construction, designed by Taylor, which was the post office and is the Museum of Nebraska Art, now with a big addition just finished, and we should all get on a field trip and go and see the fabulous new museum reopened. But think about James Knox Taylor when you go. Fairbury, Holdridge, and finally North Platte, and a good-sized building here with full two-story pilasters or engaged columns above the brick base. So if we look at kind of the scope of Taylor's contribution to Nebraska between 1897 and 1912, we're looking at 13 big, fabulous buildings, well distributed throughout the state, postcards all. Jim McKee would call this a little divagation. That's when you go off to the side, but you're going to come back to the main topic. Back in Washington, D.C., R. James Knox Taylor has responsibility for the replacement of the east facade colonnade of the Treasury building itself, which had originated on the drawing boards of Robert Mills back in the 1830s. Mills only had available soft sandstone of a not terribly appealing brown color that then turned lots of other colors with the pollution of Washington air at the time, lots of coal burning, and they decided they have to replace that whole giant colonnade with granite. And now with granite technology improved and shipping and budgets much increased, they are all going to be granite monoliths, each one a single huge stone, each one weighing something like 37 tons. They were just enormously heavy. And one by one, they're replacing them all down the face of the building and taking out the similar sized, old, cruddy sandstone ones. And various schemes are voiced of how to use all those spare columns they've taken out. And eventually, almost all of them are dynamited. They're just blown to smithereens. My friend writing the book on the Treasury building in Washington is writing that they're all gone until her friend in Lincoln tells her, oh no, they're not all gone. 4 of them got sent off to Lincoln, Nebraska, put at the head of Antelope Park when that was O Street, taken down by the Parks Department and put in their boneyard of neat things we'll use again later somewhere, until as a bicentennial project they go out to Pioneers Park and there are the columns. The only surviving Robert Mills columns from the Treasury building are the ones we have here in Lincoln. And Pam used this in her book to say, but they do exist. Next, we've had to skip all the way up to following James Knox Taylor. And Oscar Wenderoth has a brief term. He had been in the supervising architect's office for a few years. His biggest Nebraska contribution, free and single, is this building in McCook, a handsome post office courthouse. But he also has a big project in Lincoln, which is to take the already overcrowded new post office courthouse and double it in size. Less than a decade after it was finished. And much of that, I think, was not solely poor planning, it was budgeting. how much can we afford to build at one time? And they give Wenderoth a new budget, and he, after Taylor's first budget to extend his own building, the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce reacts saying, we aren't going to accept a lean-to. So it was going to be such a minor, probably just the mail sorting room addition, and they reject it and lobby for and finally win a sufficient budget for the whole mail room. If you know Blue Orchid Restaurant and the Magnolia Room, is it beside it? The reception room beside it, that's the mail sorting room that's added by this project. Vast space wrapped in additional office space up on the P Street face. Remarkable, not just that they're adding it so soon, but they're going back and remodeling the building they just finished. You can see on the exterior, the windows, the center windows of the James Knox Taylor have been altered to match the new windows on the new addition. And to compare them a little more readily, we see where each floor had been just punched windows on the P Street face on the original. Now we've developed that taller pairs of windows on the third and fourth floors on the P Street face. And also rearranged a lot of the interior with the instructions that wherever possible, they would take the oak, the marble, and the cast iron work and move it from the one interior to the next, so they don't throw it all away. And the fountain gets moved down to the P Street frontage, and here apparently the water, the artesian well had run dry. Nobody was drinking from this one, and this stood here from the teens, about 20 years it stood on P Street until it's displaced and destroyed by the next wing attached. Following Wenderoth, we have James Wetmore with the longest tenure of any of the supervising architects. He's in almost 20 years. He always called himself, even though he was appointed fully to be in charge of the office, on cornerstones throughout Nebraska, it always says acting supervising architect, because he, like Kemper, was an attorney. He'd been brought in an administrative role, and they've got all these contracts and accounting, and there's a huge administrative task to the office, but he was not a designer. And so his scrupulous listing of himself as acting supervising architect, or it's rather kind of the supervising acting architect, because he was fully supervising, but he was supervising designers. But that's how he always described himself. It was an era in the second and third and partly into the fourth decades of the 20th century where they're trying to become more systematic on what are we putting in each community. They're not really doing a cookie cutter design, but they do define under instructions of Secretary of the Treasury McAdoo. McAdoo said, we ought to have some system. Let's have first and second and third grade of post offices and courthouses. Let's do them by the revenue produced at that post office, the population of the city, the prominence of the site. And so he's going to weigh, seems still to be a very subjective set of scale, but it would put you into one of three pots on what the budget might be, and you get some similarity then between the designs produced, somewhat like the Carnegie Libraries, where it's the budget that's setting the similarity, not the designers. Although you know it's a post office when you come upon it. We're never surprised in these designs. Here we have one of Wetmore's first for Alliance, 1916 to 18. Then we're going to step up to Central City. This one had been authorized in 1913, but they didn't get it built for a dozen years because they were still working on a site and getting the budget finalized. And then Broken Bow. But we're going to be building dozens of post offices around the country. During Wetmore's term, it's estimated that the office turned out somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 buildings. So it's a vast number of buildings. Not all of them in Nebraska, certainly, but a nice share and quite a few buildings. So to look at just a little representation, there's a lot of them. Sydney in 1931, Crete in 31, David City 31 to 34, and Superior 32 to 35. All of them coming out of the office, but not the drawing board of Wetmore. The drawing board instead was his principal in the architectural division was a man named Louis Simon, and so he's probably the chief designer of all of those, or at least supervising the designers of all of those preceding buildings. He has the office himself for just 5 years, 34 to 39, and it's the final 5 years of the supervising architect organization of federal architecture. And for some reason, and I know not what the reason is, on this beautiful little courthouse or post office that he did in Seward, on the cornerstone it identifies Richard W. Grant under Simon's name as the architect for this building. Grant was a Beatrice architect who did lots of school buildings and some Carnegie libraries, had a long career in Nebraska, dies a year after this building is finished. How and why Simon's reaching out to him, I'm not sure, but this is Simon, an example of a post office built during Simon's era on the top job of the office. He had been the chief designer back through almost all of Wetmore's time, so he has a larger impact. But here he's turned to a Nebraskan as the identified architect on this building. Simon's other major activity impacting Nebraska is to finally finish off the Lincoln Courthouse Post Office as we know it, as perhaps Old Fed or Grand Manse. They have to tear off the finished west end of the Teens building and start building then on the remainder of the lot, north half of the lot, west end, the last piece. So we're looking over the new construction, 1939, under Simon's office to the center, the old post office courthouse, and just to the left of it, the corner of Knox Taylor's. So we've got really kind of all 4 generations of Lincoln Federal buildings up to this time in this one 1939 view. And then it starts to go up here on the alley side and up. And finally, we've got a building that on the P Street front looks like one design, one unified design, but it's been accomplished over 4 decades. From 1902 with the first drawing of the west end to 1941 when we finished the far 1902 the first drawing of the east end, 41 when we finished the west end. Seen from the back, we've now built the C-shaped building around the low sawtooth roof mail sorting room. And there's the 3 generations of that building going up, or if we want to do it this way, 04 to 06, 15, 16, 39 to 41. And certainly not the way you experience it walking by. You could see it to some extent on the interior as finishes changed over the periods. You can't walk through the building as fully now that it's condos and commercial space. And so I'll just end with, you want to know more? Placemakers of Nebraska, the architects, and all of those blue names have more information behind them. And I still haven't felt quite comfortable taking off the page in development from the top, because I know a few more things that's always in development. It's the beauty of this site. But until I've put all of I have in my head at the moment, I can't take that off the site. That's the supervising architect and the impact on our little state. Not in the book, but it is on the webpage.